I guess he couldn't even afford a lawyer. My father didn't bother lowering his voice. It carried clean across the courtroom, sharp enough that a few people behind him let out quiet, knowing laughs. I kept walking. The sound of my shoes echoed against the old tile floor of Norfolk County Probate Court. I held a worn leather folder tight against my chest and took my seat alone at the defense table. Dad leaned back like he'd already won. My mother sat beside him, arms folded, offering me a thin, almost satisfied smile. Their attorney, Thomas Greer, adjusted his cufflinks and glanced at me with something between pity and certainty. Judge Bennett entered. Everyone stood. I straightened automatically. 22 years in the Navy doesn't leave your body, it settles into it. Greer began smoothly. Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter involving the estate of Evelyn Whitaker. The courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. An older woman stepped inside, silver hair neatly pulled back, carrying a sealed manila envelope. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. The room shifted anyway. Judge Bennett recognized her instantly. Miss Holloway. Greer stopped mid-sentence. My father frowned. Who the hell is that? Margaret Holloway walked forward and handed the envelope to the judge. Direct instructions from Evelyn Whitaker, she said calmly. To be opened only if her grandson appears without representation. The judge broke the seal, read one page. Then he froze. Greer took the document next. The color drained from his face. Oh my God, he whispered. And that was the moment my family realized my grandmother had been planning this for years. 3 weeks earlier, I stood alone in a small cemetery outside Wilmington, North Carolina, while cold February wind moved through rows of gray headstones. My grandmother had always hated dramatic funerals. Waste of money, she used to say. So the service was small, quiet, simple, exactly the way she wanted it. I wore my Navy dress blues because I'd flown in straight from Norfolk after my leave was approved. I didn't have time to change, not that it would have mattered. My parents didn't hug me when I arrived. Dad gave a brief nod toward my uniform. Still doing all that Navy stuff. 22 years of service, reduced to a sentence. I should have been used to it by then. Somehow, I wasn't. After the burial, people gathered inside the church hall, folding tables, casseroles, store-bought desserts, weak coffee in plastic cups, low gospel music humming through an old speaker. No one talked about my grandmother. They talked about her house. The taxes alone are going to be a mess, my mother said, stirring sweet tea like she was discussing the weather. Dad nodded. We'll probably sell the place quick. No point holding on to it. I looked up. He gave me a puzzled look, like I'd interrupted something I didn't understand. Well, obviously. I held his gaze for a few seconds. My grandmother's farmhouse sat on 12 acres just outside town. It wasn't worth millions, but it mattered. The porch, the garden, the oak tree where she read every evening with a cup of coffee in her hand. That place wasn't just property. It was her life. You already decided to sell it? I asked. Mom sighed like I was being difficult on purpose. Nathan, these things are complicated. You live in Virginia. You're never here. Never here. I'd heard that my entire adult life. Never here for birthdays, never here for holidays, never here when something broke. As if service was some kind of escape instead of responsibility. My older brother, Caleb, stood nearby loading deviled eggs onto a paper plate, eyes fixed on the table like it might save him from having to say anything. That was his specialty, avoiding things, especially when Dad was wrong. Dad lowered his voice slightly. Your grandmother depended on us these last few years. I almost laughed. I was the one calling her every Sunday. No matter where I was stationed, the one wiring money when something broke, the one she told the truth to when she didn't want to worry anyone else. My parents visited when it was convenient. I showed up because I meant it. Later that night, after everyone left, I checked into the same roadside motel I always used when I came back. Same flickering sign, same stale smell buried deep in the walls. I sat on the edge of the bed, still half in uniform, and opened the last letter my grandmother had given me. Her handwriting shook more than it used to, but it was still hers. Nathan, if you're writing this, I'm probably somewhere arguing about the quality of coffee in the afterlife. I let out a quiet breath. Listen carefully. You were never hard to love. Don't let anyone rewrite your life and convince you otherwise. I had to stop reading. No one had ever said that to me before. Not once. Not in 42 years. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. I leaned back and closed my eyes. And suddenly, I was 19 again. Standing in our kitchen holding enlistment papers while Dad told me I was throwing my life away. You leave now, he'd said, Don't expect this house to wait for you. Caleb said nothing. Mom cried. Only Grandma stood up, grabbed her keys, and drove me to the recruiter's office the next morning. You go see the world, she told me. What if I fail? She squeezed my shoulder. Then fail like a man who chose his own life. I never forgot that. The morning after the funeral, Dad called before sunrise, not to ask how I was doing, not to talk about her. Probate's getting messy, he said. You might want to get yourself a lawyer. I stood by the motel window, staring out at the empty highway. Why? There was a pause. Your grandmother left. Confusing paperwork. That was the first moment something didn't sit right. My grandmother didn't do confusing. She labeled extension cords. She kept receipts from the 1980s. Whatever was happening, it wasn't an accident. And somehow, she'd already seen it coming. I didn't sleep much after that call. Rain tapped against the motel window most of the night, steady and quiet, while trucks rumbled down the highway outside. Around 3 a.m, I gave up trying and walked to the lobby for coffee. It tasted burnt enough to strip paint. Grandma would have liked that. Builds character, she used to say. I sat there alone, holding the paper cup with both hands, replaying my father's words. Probate litigation, confusing paperwork, get yourself a lawyer. None of it fit. My grandmother didn't make mistakes like that, not legal ones, not any kind, really. Which meant one thing. Whatever was happening was intentional. The next afternoon, I drove out to the farmhouse. The gravel road felt narrower than I remembered. Winter had stripped the trees bare, and the old white house sat under a gray sky like something waiting to be forgotten. My father's truck was already there. So was my mother's SUV. I stayed in the car for a moment. Watching through the windshield, Dad stood near the barn talking to a realtor. A realtor. Grandma had been buried less than 24 hours earlier. Something inside me didn't snap. It settled. I stepped out and walked toward the porch. Dad saw me and frowned immediately. What are you doing here? I stopped a few feet from him. It's her house. Not for long. The realtor pretended to examine the fence line. My mother came out of the front door carrying a cardboard box filled with photo albums, cookbooks, loose papers. My chest tightened. What are you doing? Cleaning, she said. She died yesterday. Mom exhaled like I was the problem. Nathan, this isn't a movie. Life moves on. That phrase again, life moves on. People always say that when they want permission to move too fast. I walked past them into the house. The smell hit first. Coffee, lavender, old wood. Her. Everything looked the same. The blanket still folded on the couch. Her reading glasses beside the lamp. A half-finished crossword on the kitchen table. For 1 second, it felt like she might walk in and ask if I wanted something to eat. Then the silence settled back in. Dad's voice followed me inside. She wasn't thinking clearly near the end. I turned. Don't do that. He rubbed his jaw. She got confused sometimes. No. 3 months ago, she'd beaten me at poker and explained why half the defense contracts in this country were overpriced. Confused people don't do that. Mom set the box down. There were a lot of papers, legal things, notes, financial stuff. What kind of papers? Dad answered too quickly. Nothing important. That was the moment I knew. They were hiding something. I didn't argue. Not then. Not with the realtor standing 10 feet away. I waited. That evening, after they finally left, the house felt different. Not empty. Full of everything they didn't understand. I walked slowly through each room, letting my hand brush against familiar things. The hallway wall still held my Navy graduation photo from Great Lakes. Centered. Not Caleb's high school awards. Not Dad's business plaque. Mine. Grandma had always made sure of that. I stopped. Something was off. One of the picture frames was slightly crooked. That didn't happen in this house. I stepped closer and lifted it carefully. There was a small envelope taped to the wall behind it. My pulse kicked hard, fast. 5 words were written across the front in her shaky handwriting. For Nathan, if necessary. I sat down at the kitchen table before opening it. Inside was a short note. If your parents challenge anything, call Margaret Holloway immediately. Trust no one else. Below it, a business card. Margaret Holloway, Washington. D.C. Military, Estate, and Federal Counsel. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I let out a quiet breath. Of course, even at the end, she'd been planning ahead. I first met Margaret Holloway when I was 23. At the time, I was stationed in Bahrain during one of the hardest stretches of my career. Back-to-back deployments, minimal sleep, constant pressure, the kind of environment where you learn to function without asking yourself how you feel. That was also the year my marriage ended. Not because of one fight, not because of one mistake, because distance has a way of turning silence into something permanent. I remember sitting on a metal bench outside the barracks after signing the final papers. The air was thick with heat and jet fuel. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't know what came next. Not in the Navy. In life, I called my grandmother that night. I didn't plan to say much, but once I heard her voice, everything I'd been holding in just came out. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, steady honesty. I don't think I know how to live a normal life, I told her. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush to fix it. After a long pause, she said, "There's nothing wrong with men who survive differently." I sat there staring at the ground for a long time after that. A week later, a package arrived. Coffee, socks, a handwritten note, and a neatly organized folder with legal documents I needed for the divorce. Inside was a second note. "Margaret helped with this. She's sharper than most people in Washington." That was my grandmother. Even her comfort came prepared. The next morning, I called the number from the card I'd just found in her house. "Margaret Holloway speaking." "This is Nathan Whitaker," I said. "Evelyn Whitaker's grandson." There was a brief silence. Then her voice softened. "I was wondering when you'd call. You knew her." A quiet chuckle. "Knew her. Your grandmother saved my career in 1979. That caught me off guard. "What?" "We worked together in a military legal office in D.C. She was the most detail-oriented mind in the room. People just didn't realize it." I leaned back in my chair, pieces starting to connect. "She planned this, didn't she?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. "Your grandmother understood people very well," she said finally. "Especially your parents." The room felt colder all of a sudden. "She was concerned," Margaret continued. "She believed they might try to pressure the estate once she was gone." I closed my eyes. Even dying, she'd been protecting me. "Can you come to Norfolk next Thursday?" Margaret asked. "That's the hearing date." "I know." There was a pause. Then she added, "Bring no attorney." I frowned. "Why?" "Trust me." I looked out the farmhouse window. Dead roses bent in the winter wind. For a second, I felt the old hesitation, the instinct to handle things myself. Then, I thought about the envelope behind the frame, about the timing, about her. "All right," I said quietly. Margaret's voice softened again. "Your grandmother loved you very much, Nathan." After we hung up, I sat there in silence. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't unsure anymore. I was ready. The morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the motel mirror, buttoning my uniform with hands that looked steadier than I felt. Outside, Norfolk was wrapped in cold gray rain again. Funny how storms show up right on time. I studied my reflection for a moment. 42 years old, 22 years in the Navy, multiple deployments, a failed marriage, no place that had ever fully felt like home. And somehow, one probate courtroom still had the power to make me feel like I was 16 again, standing in a kitchen waiting to be told I wasn't enough. I picked up my grandmother's letter from the sink and folded it into my inner pocket. Then, I left. The courthouse parking lot was already crowded when I arrived. My parents stood near the entrance under a black umbrella. Their attorney, Thomas Greer, stood a few feet away smoking, looking relaxed. Caleb lingered off to the side, hands buried in his jacket pockets. Dad spotted me first. His expression tightened immediately. "You really came without counsel." I locked my car. "That seems to bother you." "It concerns me." No. What concerned him was uncertainty. My father liked control. Predictable outcomes. Clear leverage. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what I knew. Mom stepped closer. "Nathan, we can still handle this privately." I looked at her. "Privately," Dad cut in. "Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly near the end. No reason to drag this out in court." There it was again. Not thinking clearly. I felt the anger rise, then forced it back down. Grandma deserved better than a parking lot argument. "What exactly are you afraid the judge might see?" I asked. Dad's face hardened. "Don't start." Caleb said nothing. We walked inside together. Probate courtroom B felt smaller than it should have. Old wooden benches, fluorescent lights humming overhead, papers shifting, quiet whispers in the back rows. Small-town curiosity always shows up when money's involved. Greer stood at the front table, organizing files with practiced confidence. He looked up when I approached. "Commander Whitaker." "Still no attorney?" "No, sir." His smile widened slightly. "Well, that's certainly your decision." Translation: "This will be easy." I took my seat without responding. Dad leaned toward Mom and whispered something that made her smirk. For a brief second, I remembered being 19, telling them I was enlisting. Dad laughed. Mom said I didn't understand what I was giving up. Caleb stayed quiet. Some things don't change. Judge Bennett entered at exactly 9. Everyone stood. The hearing began immediately. Greer moved first, voice calm and controlled. Your Honor, this matter concerns the estate of Evelyn Whitaker. Specifically, a series of irregular documents discovered shortly before probate transfer. He spoke like a man who had already rehearsed the outcome. He described my parents as devoted caregivers, responsible, present, supportive. Then he described me. Commander Whitaker has been largely absent from family affairs due to extended military service. Absent. I kept my expression neutral. He continued. We believe the decedent may have been subject to undue emotional influence during periods of isolation. That made me look up. Undue influence. My grandmother had been the strongest person I knew. No one influenced her. No one. Judge Bennett adjusted his glasses. Commander Whitaker, do you intend to respond? Every eye in the room shifted toward me. My parents looked almost eager. I stood slowly. I was advised to wait, Your Honor. A pause. Greer frowned. My father's expression shifted. Just slightly. Wait for what the judge asked. The courtroom doors opened. Again. This time, no one laughed. No one whispered. They just turned. Margaret Holloway stepped inside wearing a dark coat, carrying a leather briefcase. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. The room adjusted around her. Judge Bennett stood halfway out of his chair. Miss Holloway. Greer's posture changed immediately. You're representing? No, Margaret said calmly. Removing her gloves, I am here on behalf of the documented directives of Evelyn Whitaker. Silence. Real silence. The kind that presses down on a room. Rain against the windows. Papers shifting. Someone coughing quietly in the back. Margaret opened her briefcase and removed a sealed file. Your Honor, Evelyn Whitaker prepared legal contingencies several years ago in anticipation of this exact situation. My father's face lost color. How he muttered. Margaret didn't look at him. She handed the documents to the judge. Judge Bennett read, at first quickly, then slower, then very slowly. His expression changed. Greer shifted beside the table. Your Honor, the judge handed him the file. I watched it happen. The exact moment confidence disappeared. Greer scanned the pages: property transfers, notarized statements, medical evaluations confirming full mental competency. Then the deeper layer, documented records, dates, notes, patterns, repeated attempts by my parents to pressure my grandmother during her final year. Greer's hand tightened on the paper. Oh my God, he whispered. Dad leaned forward sharply. What is it? Greer didn't answer right away. He kept reading. Then he reached the final page and stopped completely. His eyes locked on the signature at the bottom like he couldn't process it. Oh my God, he said again, quieter this time. Mom's voice trembled. What does that mean? Greer turned the page toward them. At the bottom, he said slowly, is the validating legal authority behind every document in this file. My father leaned closer. Then his knees hit the chair behind him. Hard. No, he said under his breath. Margaret Holloway, former federal military counsel, senior advisor to the Department of the Navy, one of the most respected estate litigators on the East Coast, not a consultant, not a helper, the architect. My grandmother hadn't just written documents. She'd built a defense system. Years before she died. Judge Bennett removed his glasses carefully. Based on these filings, he said, voice measured, this court recognizes full legal authority of estate transfer to Commander Nathan Whitaker. The room stayed completely still. Then he added, and furthermore, this court will review evidence suggesting potential coercion attempts against the deceased. That was the moment everything broke. My mother covered her mouth, tears spilling instantly. My father turned to Greer, panic replacing every ounce of confidence he had walked in with. You said this was routine. Greer looked at him coldly. You failed to disclose critical information. For the first time in my life, my father looked at me like I was dangerous. Not disappointing, not wrong, dangerous. And somehow, that hurt more than anything else in that room. The hearing ended in under 40 minutes. 40 minutes. That was all it took to unravel years of assumptions, control, and quiet manipulation. When I stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was still gray. No applause, no sense of victory. Just wind, cold air, and a strange, hollow silence. Margaret walked beside me. You handled yourself well, she said. I barely spoke. That's often the smartest approach. We stopped near the courthouse steps. I looked at her. How long did she plan this? Margaret gave a small, knowing smile. Longer than you think. I nodded slowly. That sounded exactly right. Because this was never just about property. It was about protection. And even at the end, she had made sure I wouldn't stand alone. The drive back to the farmhouse felt longer than it should have. The rain had stopped, but the roads were still wet, reflecting dull gray skies that stretched endlessly ahead. I kept both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, radio off. Silence felt easier. At some point, my phone buzzed. Then again, and again. I didn't need to check to know who it was. When I finally stopped at a red light, I glanced down. 6 missed calls. 3 from Mom, 2 from Dad, 1 from Caleb. I turned the screen off and set the phone face down. Not out of anger. I just didn't have anything to say yet. The farmhouse came into view just before sunset. It looked different, not because anything had changed, but because something had ended. I parked beside the porch and sat there for a moment. Engine still running. This was supposed to feel like a win. It didn't. I stepped inside. The house greeted me with that same quiet presence. Not empty, never empty. Just still. I walked into the kitchen and started making coffee without thinking. The old machine rattled and groaned like it always had. I almost smiled. Grandma used to say it built patience. I carried the mug into the living room and sat down in her recliner. That's when it hit. Not the court, not the documents, not even my parents' faces when everything collapsed. The truth. Confirmed. Final. Stamped by a judge in a room full of witnesses. My parents never really understood me. Maybe they never wanted to. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Memories started lining up whether I asked for them or not. Missed holidays. Quick phone calls between deployments. Promotions that got a nod instead of pride. The time Dad told someone at church that Caleb was the one who stayed loyal to the family. As if leaving to build a life meant abandoning one. I exhaled slowly. There it was. Not anger. Not anymore. Just something heavier. Acceptance. I stood and walked over to the shelf where the photos were kept. Most of them were Caleb. His wedding. His kids. His life. All the milestones my parents understood. Then there were mine. Uniforms. Ceremonies. Airfields. Always in motion. Always just outside whatever home was supposed to mean. I picked up one frame, my Navy graduation photo. Centered. Just like she'd kept it. I ran my thumb along the edge of the glass. You always saw me, I said quietly. The words sounded different out loud. Simpler. Truer. Outside, the light faded slowly across the fields. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee and sat down where she used to sit every evening. The air was cold, but not harsh. Just quiet. For the first time since the hearing, I let myself feel it. Not the victory. The loss. Not of the case. Of the idea I'd held onto for years. That, one day, if I just did enough, if I just stayed steady long enough, they might finally understand. I stared out toward the darkening tree line. They weren't going to. And strangely, that hurt less than it used to. Somewhere in the distance, a truck passed along the road. The sound faded quickly. Everything else stayed still. I took another sip of coffee, now lukewarm. And for the first time, in a long time, I stopped trying to prove anything. It was just past 7 when headlights cut across the front yard. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Caleb's truck always sounded the same, engine a little rough, like it had something to say but never quite did. I opened the door before he reached the porch. He stopped a few steps away, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. Hey. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he glanced past me into the house. Can I come in? I stepped aside. We sat at the kitchen table. Same spot we used to eat pancakes on Sunday mornings, while Grandma moved around the stove like she had all the time in the world. Now it was just us. Caleb stared at his hands for a while before speaking. I should have said something sooner. I nodded once. Yeah. Silence stretched between us. Not hostile. Just overdue. They treated you differently, he said finally. Your whole life. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Caleb rubbed his face, exhaling slowly. I knew it. There it was. Simple. Honest, late. He hesitated. I didn't want to fight Dad. I leaned back slightly. You didn't want to lose your place. His eyes flicked up to mine. Then, away again. Yee. At least he didn't deny it. That house, the business, everything. It all ran through him, Caleb said quietly. It still does. I know. Another pause. You got out, he added. You built something on your own. That's not how he sees it. Caleb let out a dry laugh. No. He sees it like you walked away. I looked down at the table. That had always been the difference. I left to build a life. He stayed to keep one. You know what's crazy, Caleb said. What? Grandma always talked about you like you were the strong one. I almost smiled. She had a generous definition of strong. No, he said, shaking his head. She didn't. That landed harder than I expected, because Caleb didn't say things like that, unless he meant them, and he'd spent most of our lives not saying anything at all. I'm not asking you to fix anything, he said after a while. I know I don't get to do that. You can't, I said. Not by yourself. He nodded. I just didn't want you thinking I didn't see it. I met his eyes then. You saw it, I said. You just stayed quiet. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, just sat there with it. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said, you were right to leave. I didn't answer right away. Then I gave a small nod. Yeah, I said, I know. He stepped outside into the cold, closing the door quietly behind him. I stood there for a moment after he was gone, not angry, not relieved, just aware of something I hadn't fully named before. Silence doesn't just protect people. It costs them. It was fully dark by the time the next set of headlights pulled into the driveway. Slower this time. Careful. I already knew it wasn't Caleb. I opened the door before she knocked. My mother stood there, clutching her purse tightly against her chest, like she needed something solid to hold on to. For a moment, she looked smaller than I remembered, older, too. I won't stay long, she said. I stepped aside. She didn't take off her coat, just sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes moving around the room like she was seeing it differently now. This place still smells like her, she said quietly. Yeah. Silence settled between us. Then, she said it. She always admired you. I looked up. Grandma. Mom nodded. She talked about you all the time. Something tightened in my chest. She admired your independence, Mom continued. The way you didn't wait for permission to live your life. I leaned back slightly. That's not what you and Dad called it. No, she said softly. It wasn't. Another pause. Then she said something I never expected to hear. You became everything I didn't have the courage to be. The words sat there between us. Heavy, uncomfortable. True, I studied her for a moment. All those years. I thought she just agreed with him, followed him, backed him. I never considered that, maybe, she was afraid of the same thing he was, losing control of the version of life they understood. You could have said something, I said finally. She nodded. I know. You didn't. No, at least. She didn't try to dress it up. She looked down at her hands. Your father thought you were rejecting us when you left, she said. He took it personally. I didn't leave to hurt him. I know that now. That word again. Now. It always shows up late. She stood after a few minutes. Didn't try to hug me. Didn't try to fix anything. At the door. She paused. He went too far, she said quietly. And I let him. I crossed my arms. Yeah. She nodded once. Then she left. The house felt different after that. Quieter. But clearer. I walked back into the kitchen and picked up the envelope Margaret had given me after court. Only after the hearing, she'd said. I sat down and opened it carefully. 4 pages, handwritten. The first line hit harder than anything that had happened all day. Nathan, if you're reading this, then I was right about what would happen. I closed my eyes for a second, then kept going. First things first, the house, the land, the money. None of it is your burden. I swallowed. It is not payment for pain, and it is not a reward for suffering. My grip tightened on the paper. I left it to you because you understand responsibility, not because you endured more than anyone else, but because you chose to. I leaned back slowly, letting that settle. Outside, the wind moved softly across the fields. Then I turned to the last page, and everything shifted. Nathan, do not become hard just because others were hard with you. I exhaled slowly. Bitterness is a lonely way to grow old. I've seen too much of it already. My throat tightened. If this family breaks after I'm gone, let it break because of truth, not revenge. I stared at the words, didn't move, didn't think, just let them sit. Then the last line. You are stronger than your anger. Don't forget that. I stayed at the table long after I finished reading, long enough for the coffee beside me to go cold, long enough for the house to settle into silence again. And somewhere in that quiet, something inside me loosened. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to fight them anymore. I met Margaret 3 days later at a small waterfront restaurant in Norfolk. Gray water stretched out beyond the windows. Boats rocking gently against their moorings, the kind of place my grandmother would have liked, quiet, unpretentious, with strong coffee and no rush to leave. Margaret ordered black coffee and tomato soup. "Your grandmother loved this place," she said, unfolding her napkin. I gave a faint nod. She had a talent for finding places that didn't try too hard. Margaret smiled. That she did. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. The Navy. Old stories. The way my grandmother used to correct people without raising her voice, but somehow still make them feel it. Then Margaret looked at me. "What will you do now?" I stirred my coffee slowly. "I don't know yet." She studied me for a moment. "You could pursue further action." I knew what she meant. The evidence we'd uncovered, the pressure. The manipulation was enough to push things further. Civil penalties, financial consequences, public exposure. A version of me, years ago, might have wanted that. To make it hurt, to make it even. I looked out at the water. "I don't think I do," I said. Margaret didn't respond right away. "I think she already won," I added quietly. That earned a small, approving nod. "Yes," she said. "I believe she did." Over the next few weeks, I made decisions my family didn't expect. I sold a small piece of undeveloped land near the highway. Not much, just enough to create something that mattered. A scholarship fund. Nothing large, nothing public. Just support for families with kids in the Navy, tuition help. Emergency assistance, things that don't make headlines but change lives. I named it after her, the Evelyn Whitaker Family Resilience Fund. Margaret cried when I told her. My father called twice, left messages about fairness, about working things out. I didn't call back, not out of spite. I just understood something now. Some conversations don't lead anywhere new. They just reopen things you've already closed. I kept the farmhouse, didn't rush it, didn't try to turn it into something it wasn't. I fixed what needed fixing, repaired the porch steps, repainted the kitchen, planted new roses where hers used to grow. Simple work, honest work, the kind that gives you time to think without forcing you to. Life slowed down, not all at once, but enough. Morning coffee on the porch, wind moving through the trees, silence that didn't feel empty anymore, just steady. One afternoon, while I was working in the garden, my neighbor, Mrs. Donahue, leaned over the fence. "You know something," she said. "What's that?" "Your grandmother didn't save you with money." I wiped dirt from my hands. "No," she smiled gently. "She saved you with love." I looked out across the yard, the porch, the oak tree, the house that had somehow outlasted everything. And for the first time, I understood what she really left me. Not land, not control, not victory. Permission. Permission to stop trying to earn something that should have been given freely. That turned out to be worth more than anything else. A year later, the farmhouse didn't feel like something I had inherited. It felt like something alive again. The porch had fresh paint. White, the way Grandma liked it. Flower boxes hung beneath the windows, filled with yellow daisies and red geraniums that leaned toward the afternoon sun. Wind chimes moved gently above the steps, catching the breeze just enough to make a soft, familiar sound. The kind that settles into you. Not loud, not demanding, just present. People started arriving around noon. Nothing formal. No invitations printed or mailed. Just word passed quietly. Friends from the Navy drove in from Norfolk. A couple of them hadn't seen me out of uniform in years. Neighbors brought food like they always did, casseroles, pies, things that didn't need explaining. Margaret arrived carrying a small box of photographs. "Found these in an old file," she said. "Thought they belonged here." I took them from her carefully. "Thank you." She studied the house for a moment, then nodded. She would have liked this. I almost said something back. Didn't trust my voice to stay steady. Caleb showed up early. He moved differently now. Not dramatic, just more aware, like someone who had started paying attention to things he used to avoid. "You need help with anything?" he asked. I handed him a stack of folding chairs. "Set these up near the tree." He nodded. "Got it." Simple, but it mattered. By mid-afternoon, the yard was full. People talking, laughing, sharing stories about a woman who had quietly shaped more lives than most of them realized. Margaret told one about Grandma correcting a Pentagon attorney in the middle of a meeting. She didn't raise her voice, Margaret said, shaking her head, just handed him his own paperwork and pointed to the error. "That sounds like her," I said. Margaret smiled. He never made that mistake again. For a while, I just stood there, watched, listened, For years, I thought loneliness was permanent, something built into the structure of my life. But standing there, hearing laughter drift across the yard, I realized something. Loneliness changes when you stop waiting for the wrong people to understand you. Then I saw the truck, pulling slowly into the driveway. Conversation didn't stop, but it shifted, subtle. My father stepped out first. He looked older. Not just physically, though, that was part of it. His shoulders had dropped slightly. His hair had gone almost completely gray. But it was something else, too. The certainty was gone. My mother stepped out beside him, quieter than I'd ever seen her. They walked up together. "Hi, Nathan," she said softly. "Hi." Dad looked around the property, the porch, the garden, the barn, everything my grandmother had built and everything I'd chosen not to tear down. "You fixed it up," he said. "Yeah." He nodded once. "Looks good." They stayed near the edge of the gathering, talked politely with neighbors, listened to stories, didn't interrupt, didn't try to take control of the space. For the first time in my life, they didn't act like they owned it. As the sun started to drop, people began heading out. One by one, the yard emptied, cars pulled away, voices faded, the light softened. Margaret hugged me before she left. "She'd be proud of you," she said quietly. I nodded. That was enough. By the time the last car disappeared down the road, the house had settled back into silence. I was gathering empty cups near the fence when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn right away. "Son." I did then. Dad stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking out toward the field instead of at me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Crickets filled the space. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I was hard on you." I tied off the trash bag slowly. "Yeah," I said. "You were." No anger in it, just fact. He nodded. "You leaving for the Navy?" He started, then stopped. "I thought you were walking away from us." I looked at him. "I was trying to build something," I said, "not leave something." He took that in, slowly. "My father," he said after a moment, "was the same way." I didn't interrupt. Everything was about control. He continued. "Respect meant doing things his way." A dry breath left him. I guess I didn't question it. Just passed it on. The honesty caught me off guard. Not because it fixed anything, but because it was real. "I spent a lot of time trying to control people," he said. "Not enough time trying to understand them." The wind moved lightly through the trees behind us. I glanced toward the porch, where my mother stood quietly, watching but not stepping in. Then back at him. Part of me still hurt, probably always would. Some things don't disappear, but something my grandmother wrote came back to me then. "Let truth end the cycle, not revenge." I nodded once. "I know." His eyes watered for just a second before he looked away. That was it. No long speech, no full apology. Just a man, standing there, finally seeing part of what he'd done, and not knowing how to fix it. Strangely, that was enough. Not enough to erase anything, not enough to rebuild what wasn't there, but enough to stop carrying it forward. Later that night, after they left, I sat alone on the porch. The house behind me glowed softly. The wind chimes moved overhead. I held my grandmother's letter in my hands again, the paper worn from reading. Out beyond the yard, the land stretched quiet and still under the night sky. For the first time in a long time, everything felt steady. Not perfect, not healed, but steady. And that was more than I used to have. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's this. Time doesn't fix distance. Silence doesn't heal what's been ignored. And pride has a way of stealing years you don't get back. If there's someone you still care about, reach out before it's too late. And if you've spent your life feeling overlooked, misunderstood, or like you had to earn your place in your own family, you didn't. Your worth was never decided by the people who failed to see it. Sometimes, the people who love us right are the ones who quietly teach us how to finally love ourselves.